Good morning. Today's scripture is John 17, verses 14 through 18. I have given them your word, and the world has hated them. For they are not of the world any more than I am of the world. My prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. They are not of the world, even as I am not of it. Sanctify them by the truth. Your word is the truth. As you sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, John. Good morning. Go ahead and turn your Bibles to Mark chapter 2. I grew up in a rather secure, healthy church environment. We had good preaching. Our preacher was a good preacher. He was a young guy. But he spent about 13 years there. So most of my growing up was spent under this fella, and it was a loving fellowship. It was a picturesque surroundings. That first building looks very similar to the first building that we were in, and the second building is the building that we replaced it with. We built that in 1962, and I'm pleased to say I was a teenager, and I had a part in building that. I put in a lot of the insulation up in the rafters, and as did other teenagers my age, worked on that. And I think it was a good setting. So I had a healthy church environment. But for some reason, about 4th or 5th grade, I became aware of other fellowships, other churches. And I began to wonder if our church was the right one. And I'm not sure exactly why I began puzzling that question, but I did. And it was a question that haunted me for some time. In fact, all through my teen years and into my early adulthood, that question haunted me. Am I sure that my church is the right one? Can you identify that question? Does anybody connect with that? I see some nods. I suspect that some of you could identify that question. I've encountered people over my years of ministry that were so afraid of that question that they just kind of blocked their ears. They didn't even want to think that. They didn't want to even think about that question because it was so terrifying to them. Well, I believe today's text relates to that question, and what I want us to do is to look at the text, and then we'll work our way back to this question. Does that make sense? And we'll look at the question then in context with the passage. Mark chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. Once again, Jesus went out beside the lake. A large crowd came to him, and he began to teach them. And as he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," Jesus told him. And Levi got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and the disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It is not the healthy who need a physician, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." One of the things I want you to see is that the incessant call of Jesus is that we follow him. That's the fundamental, basic call of Jesus, is that we follow him. We find this call over and over and over through the Gospels. In fact, 20 times in the Gospels, we find Jesus using the words, "Follow me." A little earlier, he had said these words to the fishermen. You remember Peter, Andrew, James, and John, as they were mending their nets, he went around and he said, "Follow me," and they did. A little bit later, he said these words to the crowds. He also said these same words to the rich young man that he very much wanted to reach. He said, "Follow me." And he used these words to those who were making excuses for their procrastinations. He told them, "Follow me." And finally, to Peter, who was most concerned about what the future of John was going to be, Jesus said to him, "You must follow me." So this is a call of God all through the Gospels, and predictably it is an incessant call of Jesus to us today. We're to follow him. And that's the call that we find with Jesus for Levi, the tax collector. He wanted Levi to follow him. This tax collector, this individual who was an outcast, he wanted this outcast to follow him. We need to understand that following Jesus does not call for us to leave our world. I think it's important for us to hear that. And I want us to look very carefully at this text at this point, because sometimes Christianity has been heavily influenced by the idea that once a person becomes a Christian, then all other ties and relationships are to be severed. Friendships with unbelievers are to be terminated or made distant. Influences are to become tightly screened. Reading material is to be strictly limited to only those things written by Christian writers. Christians are to be pulled out of those activities and settings where they might be influenced by non-believers, such as scouts and Little League and school and friends. And social activities are to be limited to church-related events. And even colonies are to be set up for living in a total Christian environment. And no, it's not just the Amish who think along these terms. It's an idea that over the last 20 years has become increasingly prevalent among conservative Christian groups. In fact, within the first 2 years, most Christians, once they become Christians, have severed 80% of their pre-Christian relationships with non-believers. Now that's across the board. That's statistic. Within the first 2 years, after becoming a believer, most Christians have severed 80% of their contacts with non-believers. Well, what's wrong with that, you ask? I mean, it's a tough world out there. One must take precautions. It's us against them. Now, I must admit, that sounds good, even to me. I'm attracted to the idea of a total Christian environment. I am. But I'm not at all sure that such an effort is Christian. First of all, because it's not us against them. It ought to be us for them. Jesus does not call us to leave our world. Jesus calls us to enter our world with him and for him. Notice the behavior of Jesus in this passage that is our text passage this morning. Look at verse 14. As he walked along, he called Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," Jesus told him. And Levi got up and followed him. Now, it's hard for us to understand the stigma of a tax collector in that culture and day. But in the Jewish world of that day, a tax collector was anathema. He was an outcast. Nobody wanted to be associated with a tax collector. Not somebody who was an orthodox, upstanding, religious, in good standing with the synagogue Jew. Not tax collector. You don't invite a tax collector to come with you. But Jesus invited Levi to come with him. He says, "Follow me." And where did they go? They went to Levi's house. And verse 15 says, while Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and disciples, for there were many who followed him. So what is Jesus doing? Well, he's associating with, he's fraternizing with, he's fellowshipping with, he's eating with, he's spending time with these outcast groups and sinners. Well, you might think, well, some might frown on that. They did. And when Jesus' behavior was called into question by the religious watchdogs of his day, he replied by saying to them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." I suggest to you that we struggle with this text if we actually read the text and hear what it's saying. We struggle with it because it's counterintuitive to much of our way of thinking. Jesus was saying to them, I didn't come to call the good folks, I came to call the sinners. I didn't come to call the righteous, upstanding folks, I came to call those who were not. Levi, in this setting, became the contact, the means by which Jesus was allowed to minister to these people who were part of his vocation and part of his social circle, which was a social circle of sinners. Levi became the conduit through which he could contact them and minister to them. And that's what he was doing in this setting. And in much the same way, we become the means, the agent, the ambassadors by which Jesus can effectively minister to those in our world, in our social circle, in our vocation. We become the contact by which he can do that, but only if we're among those people and associating with those people and integrated with them. Now, someone will object and say, it's dangerous, we're going to lose some. Perhaps some we'll even lose some of our friends and some of our children. And of course, that's true. It's much safer to stay in the boot camp or in the barracks. It's much safer to stay there. Very few soldiers are lost there except through boredom and disinterest. And I suggest to you today that quite a number of those that we are losing today, we're losing because of boredom and disinterest. Because we've kept them in the barracks, or we've kept them in boot camp, and we've not thrust them forward into battle. But we've not been called to barracks duty. We have been called to the front lines. In John 17, in verse 18, Jesus is talking with his Father, and he says, "As you sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world." And he's talking here about his disciples. As you sent me, Father, into the world, now I'm sending them. Then just 3 chapters later, we find him speaking with those disciples, and he says to them, "As the Father has sent me, I'm sending you." Where was he sending them? He was sending them into their world. He was sending them into their world where they could make a difference on their world, where they could have an impact on the world. In another place, we find Jesus healed the demoniac in Mark chapter 5. The demoniac, after being healed, he wants to climb in the boat with Jesus and travel with Jesus and his companions in the inner circle. Jesus does not allow him to do that. In fact, he says, "Go home to your family and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he's had mercy on you." He didn't need them to be in boot camp. He knew that he was ready to take back the message to the front lines and let the good news be heard by those that knew him and knew what he had been saved from. Here was a man who had been out of his mind, but Jesus had healed him. And now as he walks back into that village, he walks back in that village as a living testimony of the power of Jesus. Folks, we have people who are redeemed, who are saved, who have been changed just as dramatically as that man was changed, but they need to go back into their community so they can be walking testimonies of the power of Jesus. In Luke 19, we find Jesus' message changed the life of Zacchaeus, another tax collector. In Acts 8, we're told that the angel of the Lord directed Philip to the queen's treasurer of Ethiopia. Why the queen's treasurer? Well, he took the message back to a land that, as far as we knew, had nobody to share the gospel with them at that point, but he did. In Acts 16, Paul's message changed the life of the jailer, the same jailer who was holding him prisoner in bonds. And I suspect, from what the text says, that after the jailer was baptized, after he bound up the wounds of Paul and Silas, after he fed them, he took them back and he put them in jail and locked the bonds again. Why did I suggest that? Because the next day we find they came to let them out. In Acts 16, we find a businesswoman was transformed by the gospel. Now, that may seem kind of normal to us in our 21st century culture, but there was a time when women who were in business were not exactly considered to be your prime candidates for faith and religion. But Paul took the message to her because she needed to hear, and she responded and was changed. Well, what does all this do for us? Well, we need to understand that we will find healing and light wherever Jesus leads us. Again, verse 17 of our text. It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. In another place, Jesus said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. When I began, I told you about my puzzlings over the question, how can I know for sure that this is the right church? I'm here today to tell you that I don't struggle with that question anymore, and haven't for years. Why? Well, first of all, because it's not a biblical question. You can search your New Testament over and over, and you won't find anybody struggling with that issue or that question. That was not a New Testament question. That was not a biblical question. And secondly, it's an unnecessary concern, because our call is to follow Jesus. That's our call. We're to follow Him. And if we do that, we need not fear where He leads us. And we just need to be careful that we follow carefully in His steps. We make sure that we're following Him, not some great teacher. We need to make sure that we're following Him, not some kind of impressive group. We need to make sure that we're following Him, not just our hunches. We need to make sure that we're following Him, not just our visual image of what ought to be. We need to make sure that we're following Him. And in addition to that, we need to understand that the Bible tells us very clearly that the Lord knows those who are His. That's His realm of responsibility. It's not ours. We don't have to spend any energy on that one. And we need to understand that when we became Christians, He added us to His church. And we can become part of the finest congregation in town. But if He didn't add us to His church, it doesn't really matter. And if He added us to His church, then everything else is secondary. And so the question for you for 2012 is the question, are you a Jesus follower? And that's a question that each of us must be willing to answer and struggle with. The term Christian has become so generic and so watered down and so muddied that it's as much a political term today as it is a religious term today. But the question is, are you following Jesus? That's a real question. And hopefully, as this question is massaged throughout this year, it will challenge you to a deeper and more authentic walk with Him, and make you stronger and more clear in the sights that you're seeing and the goals that you're shooting for. And may God bless us to so walk that we don't find ourselves wandering off to some tangent, but we find ourselves dead on, always following Him. Not our opinion, not our tradition, but Him. May God bless us. My challenge to you is to grab hold of this theme and this question, are you Jesus' follower? Because this is not just a question for this morning, but it's a question for our year. And the implications of that, I think, need to be grappled with. What does that mean to my day-to-day walk and the way I live and the values I hold?